everyone. Hi, thank you for coming. So let me start off with a little bit about myself. My name is Roberta Goodhead. I'm a software engineer at the app business. I've been a software engineer for a number of years. My primary specialism is actually web, but I've been working with Flutter for the past 8 months or so, and I have to say that it is one of the best frameworks that I have worked with, and I'm not saying that because I am at a Flutter conference. So, just to preface this, my original talk was going to be called Flutter Beyond the Defaults, but I decided to talk about forms a lot more broadly. So this talk might be a bit more beginner-friendly, but I'm hoping that everybody will at least find something worthwhile, and I will go beyond the defaults at some point, but it will be more of a broad overview. Cool. So let's get started. So I'm going to cover topics such as input customization, validation, focusing, and multi-step forms. And yeah, well, forms. So I'm sure everybody in this room today has used a form, from credit card applications to online quizzes such as which Friends character you like the most. And a form in the context of digital applications simply means a way of capturing a collection of data from the end user. So, Flutter has many different types of inputs built in already. So date picker, checkbox, slider, text, time picker, radio, drop-down button, amongst others. For the time being, we're going to focus on text. So just to understand a little bit about how forms work, we're just going to start off talking about text, and then we're going to move on to custom widgets. So text field widget. Cool, so as you can see, we have a simple text field widget here. So as a lot of you might know this already, but some of you who are just starting out, this is how you would add a text field. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on the material design text fields. I will speak briefly about Cupertino later. But by default, when you add a text field, you will get the material styling. It will look like this. And this is for username, and this is for the password, where obscure text is true. You can see this property there, and that will hide the input, apart from the first few seconds, from view. Yeah, and I mean, this field is pretty flexible. You can use it for emails, numerics. There are controls in place to control what type of text you put in. And you can even use it for multi-line text. And being a web developer, not having a separate text area is a little bit, it's small, but it's mind-blowing. Not really. Okay. So, next up, I'm just going to explain a little bit more about the text editing controller. So what the text editing controller is used in this scenario is to capture input from the end user. So it is a notifier under the hood. So whenever a value changes, it will notify us listeners. And yeah, so in the context of a text field, you can see that in your widget or init state function, you will create your text editing controller. It's best to create it in the init state function, especially if you are adding a input to feed into the text field initially. You could just add an initial value here. Cool. And then you can see that we are passing the text editing controller to the text field. And then finally, we are reading the value using the .text value here. Okay. And if you just want to use if you just want to simulate inputting text in your test, then you can simply create a finder here, and then you can call tester.enter text, and then that will simulate adding the input ABC. Cool. So next I'm going to talk a bit about input decoration. And here, you can see the difference between the default decoration and custom decoration. So just to explain, input decoration, so the name comes from the decorator pattern. So this allows behaviour to be, so typically of a decorator pattern, the decorator pattern will allow behaviour to be added to an object without affecting that object itself. And the input decoration is doing a similar thing here, where it will add visual enhancements to your text field without actually changing the text field, because the text field itself is pretty basic. Without the decoration, you just have a cursor, and that's pretty much it. So by default, you will get the material styling here, and you can customize it because input decoration can accept a number of properties here for you to create this god-awful design. So here, you can change the fill color, content padding, border, error border, focus border, and amongst others, as you can see here. So you can change how it looks like when it's disabled, counter text, so that's counting how many characters you have left in your field, error text, text box appearance, text appearance, label, hint text, prefix and suffix content, error appearance, focus appearance, amongst so many other properties. And obviously you wouldn't want to apply input decoration for every single text field rather, so you can use a theme, and in the root of your material app you can specify a theme. And the properties of the input decoration theme are pretty much identical to the input decoration, except for the ones specific to that decoration, such as the label text, for example. Now, the input decoration does have some limitations. So label and error messages are limited to text only. So as you can see, if you just want text, or if you just want a error message as text, or if you want a label as text, then that's possible. But here, if you want to add a star for required, or if you want to add an exclamation mark, if your message is invalid, then it's not possible. There are ways around it, and I will get to that in a little bit. So next I'm going to talk about validation. Okay, so as many of you will know, so to make apps secure and easy to use, the information that, to make apps simple and easy to use, you want to make sure that the information that they enter is valid, and you want to display a nice, friendly message, as you can see here. Now, you can probably come up with your own validation framework, but Flutter has a set of form widgets that manages validation along with other few features as well. So it's probably worth to explore that then. So broadly speaking, there are two types of widgets: form and form field. So what you see, so this represents our form in the widget tree, and a form will have form field descendants that can be typed. So it could be typed as a string, int, or a custom class. Just to elaborate on the form field widget, the form field maintains the state of the form field, and it stores data such as the current value and the validity, so whether the field is valid or not. The form itself coordinates multiple form field widgets. So each form field can handle its own validation, but the form itself can coordinate and at once validate every form field widget. So what it can do is it can traverse down the tree, find every descendant of form field, and validate each one in turn. Now, a form field is a wrapper that can add validation to an existing input widget. And as well as validation, it can also add saving and reset functionality. And it does it in a way that is uniform and consistent across all form widgets. So it could be that one input might handle data one way, and one input's interface might be another way. And what the form field will do is it will add consistency across all of your widgets in terms of validation. So generally speaking, what you would do is you can either wrap the form field widget around your input via the builder, or you can extend, or rather implement, the form field class. But the good news is that Flutter has two convenience widgets for two types of input form field. Cool. So now I'm just going to explain a little bit more about validating these fields. Let's just go through the process. So what you want to do is, 1, create a form with a global key. 2, add a form field of validation logic. And 3, create a button to submit the form. So we're now just going to go through the steps here. So in the case of a text form field, the first thing you would do is you create a global key of type form field state, and then you will add that key to your form. And then next up, you will add a validator function. So it's simple as you see there. We want to make sure that the username is required, so we just make sure that there is a value. If the field is invalid, we return the message we want displayed to the user. Otherwise, we return null, indicating that it's valid. And then finally, we can call the validate function, and then from there we submit the data. So what validate does is it will call the validate function on every single form field. So every form field has its own validate function, and within that validate function, it will invoke the validator. So it's at that point that the error message is displayed in the text field, and if at least one of those fields is invalid, form key, this function here will return false. And then you can, but otherwise, if every field is valid, then it will return true, and then you can go ahead and proceed and submit the data. Okay, so let's talk about the case of custom form fields. This step, exactly the same. And then here's where it gets interesting. So if you don't want to use a text form field, what you can do is you can use the form field widget here. So we have our custom input. We have our validator function here, pretty similar, except that the type of value is of the type of your form field. You have your builder, and in that builder, you can get the form field state. And what you can do is when you call form field state did change, then you can update your form field state with your input value. And of course, because this is a custom form field, we want to show a custom error message. So at that point, we can just use the has error property on form field state. And if that's true, then we can just show our error message. And then what's good is that we have the error text populated with that error message. And validation proceeds as the same as before. Okay, so what about validating other fields? In this example, it's a common scenario. So the confirm password field needs to know the value of the password field in order to check that the passwords don't match. So then what we can do is we can create a password field key. And what that does is when we pass that key into our text form field, we can get access to the state of the password field and then get the value. And then here we can do our check and then return the desired error message. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about custom form fields. So do you remember when I said that the text field styling has limitations? So you can use or implement form field. So here's an example of a custom text field. And if you have a Cupertino text field as well, you can add labels and, well, actually, you can add error messages in this way as well and handle validation in this way. So what you can do, you can add your custom label. So what this label is doing under the hood is that it's just displaying it's just showing a text and an icon, and then we're just passing the error state so that we know when to change the color to red or when to show the default color. And then here, this block represents our main text field. We set the decoration to null because we don't want to use the default in this instance. And then we can just create our own border. As an alternative, you can use the editable text widget as well. So it's an even more stripped down version of text field, except that it doesn't manage focus. I think in most instances, using text field decoration null will be fine. And then, as before, you can add a custom error text widget. So what about so you can also use this to combine several widgets into one field. So in this example shows a date. It's a combination date picker and a combination time picker. So what we're doing within the first button is that when we press the button, it will show the date picker. Then we update the date portion only. And then we can call did change, and we can do exactly the same for the time. And then from there, it means that when we're validating on the date as a whole, rather than on each individual portion. Now, another feature of form field is the save function. Now, a save function will allow you just to save all the values at once. So if you want to save the values for submission, or if you just want to keep a checkpoint of all valid values, then this function is there. And it's pretty simple. You have an onSave function. In this case, we're just assigning the value to a state variable. And then, like validate, what save will do is it will go through every form field that is a child of that form and then invoke the save function of every form field, which will invoke the onSaved function of every form field. OK, cool. So next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about focusing. So as you can see here, we're just typing in some text. And it's hard to see, but when you tap on the button at the bottom right-hand corner, the focus jumps to the next field. So this is how it's done, pretty straightforward. If you want to change the icon on that button, you can just set the text input action to text input next, and then you call the next focus, so that will focus to the next node on the tree. Or if you want to request a focus of a particular node, then you can just pass in that focus node as so. In this scenario, what we want to do is we want to mark the guest fields label as blue when it's on focus. And so to do that, we create our guest focus node. And then here we have a condition. So we have the has focus status. So whenever, as in the previous screen, the guest focus node's focus is requested, then we can change the color, because has focus would have updated to true. And what that also does, it also removes focus from every other focus node. And as a side note, request focus doesn't automatically cause the widget to rebuild. So you might need to force a rebuild. I mean, one way of doing it is using an animated builder. So that's what the text form field is actually doing under the hood with text field. There are other ways of doing it, but that's just one way. And to explicitly focus on a text form field, then you can just pass in the focus node into the form field. It handles focusing internally, but this is just if you want to reference that focus node by name. Next up, multi-step forms. So sometimes when a form is too long, you might want to separate your form into separate parts, as shown here. There are multiple ways of doing it. One way of doing this is using a stepper. A stepper is a material widget. And we've just got a little demonstration here. So we enter our values. We go to continue. As so. And then within each step, we wrap a form. And the reason we do this is because we want to validate each step individually. You don't have to use a stepper. You can use a page view, or you can use a tab bar even if you want to. Same thing, have a form within each step so that the validation is limited to each step. As said here. Also, something to note, that when you're dealing with multi-step forms, it's best to define all of your data above all the steps. And if you have a submit function, just pass it in to, just reference that function in your last step, and that should do the trick. So finally, I'm just going to point out some useful tips. Okay, first of all, don't forget to dispose your text editing controllers and focus nodes. Yeah, so they are long-lived objects, so it's good practice. Next up, use the auto-validate property if you want to validate on change. So a lot of the time, when you have a form, you want the validation to go away once you have resolved the issue. So what you can do is that once you press submit and validation fails for the first time, you can set auto-validate to true so that as soon as you correct your mistake, the error message goes away. If submission fails, then focus to the first invalid field using the focus techniques that I stated earlier. It's also good practice to scroll to that field once you focus on it. So you can call scrollable, ensure visible, so that when you focus on a field, you want to make sure that you can actually see it. So this is one way of doing it. You can just get your field key, call current context, and then that way you'll be able to focus, your focus node is visible on screen. Another useful tip. So when you're testing, so earlier on I stated that you want to have access to your field state. You want to use a global key, but you still want that key to be named so that your test can actually find that key. A way around it is to use the global object key, and that way you can actually have a named key in effect, as shown here. And this is how you would use it in your test. Simple one, but just keep validation methods in separate classes so that you can reuse them. And there is actually a reset function. There isn't an on-reset function. Sorry, let me start again. If you want to make use of reset functionality, and the intended use of reset is to reset your form field values to the initial value, you can implement form field rather than just use it directly as shown here. And actually, just to extend on that, there are scenarios where you probably want to implement form field rather than use it directly, especially if you want to make reusable components. And then finally, I know I spoke about form and form field widgets, but you don't have to use them. They're merely just there as a convenience. They're just to help you out. They're there just for you to save time. And also with the form widget itself can be replaced by a technique by just passing a global key into the constructor of your widget. So you don't even have to use the form to coordinate the form field widgets. Okay, so just a few closing remarks. So the Flutter Form framework, it abstracts validation logic away from the input widget. You can integrate built-in or custom widgets, and what it will do is it provides consistency across many different types of widgets. Cool. Okay, so yeah, I just want to say thank you very much. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so this is me. I'm not very active on social media at the moment, but I do plan to post some tutorial content at some point, so this is where you'll get some updates. Cool. So are there any questions? Yes. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much. And question, is there a way to group the fields or probably forms and manage these fields? Sometimes there are cases when you, for example, need to enter something and then some part of form will become visible.
Yeah.
So is there a way to manage these cases?
I think the best way to do that would be to merge each step to wrap each step in its own form widget. So I think that it's similar to the multi-step form. It's just that you are just showing your content at different stages. So whenever you want to validate a section, if there's a block that you just want to handle validation on its own, then just wrap it in a form widget, give it a separate key, and then I think then that would be the best way. Is that okay? All right, cool. Any other questions? Oh, at the back.
Hello.
Hi.
I want to ask you how you handle validation which comes from the API with the combination of the form fields.
Yes, I had a feeling this question was going to come up. So there are cases where it can be a bit awkward, and if it's the case where, so you have a few options. So if it's a case, for example, with the username where perhaps you want to make sure that the username doesn't exist, so what you can do is it might be better to handle that separately outside of the current framework, or it might be I think at the moment it's still. I would say that this framework is more geared towards synchronous validation, and it can be awkward in that sense. So what you are probably going to be doing is going to be a few workarounds. So I would say that depending on the situation, it will probably be better just to handle that separately. And then what you can do is maybe just have a fallback with the server-side validation on submit. Okay. Hey.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Mm-hmm. So have you tried out any packages or methods of generating forms out of JSON schemas or anything coming from the back end?
Okay. So far, I've read about them, but I haven't actually tried out any of. I haven't tried out any of those techniques myself as of yet. Okay. Yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Is there any good way to validate fields during the typing, not during the submit the whole form?
Yes, so that would be using the auto-validate property. So if you set auto-validate to true, then it will validate each input on change. So when you see form field did change, and that's effectively what's happening when you're typing, is when if auto-validate is true, it's at that point that it will validate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Cool. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much.